This is House Planning Help, episode 34. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is a podcast for you if you're interested in self-building or renovating. I'm looking into what houses we should be building in the 21st century, my own personal goal to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Today, my guest is architectural designer Wilf Meynell, and we're going to be looking at environmental design. Is it taking a backseat to low energy design? An interesting topic, and we'll get stuck into that in just a few moments, but I wanted to just touch on this because it feels funny sometimes when you're putting a podcast out or writing a blog or making a video and you release that content into the public domain. It's out there in cyberspace. And then let's say I stop this podcast and I tried to retract that content. You're never quite sure in cyberspace whether you can even do that, whether it's possible or whether it might just stay around forever now. Someone else has a copy of it, or I know there are websites that try to track the whole internet. So it will be there, and perhaps many years from now, we will look back and reflect on all of the content that's created every day, and it will be a bit of history. So if you're listening to this podcast on the day it was published, then this will all be what's going on right now. But reflecting on it many years later, and I say all that because of what's in the news at the moment, there's been another hike here in the UK in gas and electricity prices, and they've gone up. Some companies about 6%, others up to 9%, and it's just crazy. I don't really see an end to this. And also at around this time, we've just had a news story that the government here in the UK has signed a deal with EDF to build Britain's first nuclear power station. They haven't built one of these for many years, so it sometimes seems as if the energy efficiency route is just not the priority, which is quite frustrating for those of us that see this as a key way to move forward. But slightly connected to that, I'm very conscious that Germany, Austria, Sweden, Denmark, all sorts of countries in Europe seem to be making much more progress than we do. So I thought that this was a good point to say that in future I'm going to try my best, whether it's on the blog or the podcast, to get more international guests to hear their stories, what they're doing. And so far, I suppose I've been restricted in that a couple of things. First of all, the quality. I like going out there with my own portable recorder that I know is good quality and I can come back, and plus then I have the chance to meet people, and it's just a much more relaxed environment to record. And then of course my build is going to be in the UK, so it's a bit more relevant to speak to people in the UK. And then there's the trust factor too, that I think to myself, well, what I don't want to do, you're listening now and you want some good information. I want to try, if at all possible, to bring you the best people that I possibly can. And I tend to feel my best way of doing that is through recommendations. So that's how it's led this far, and it's been quite a lot of interviews from the UK. But I'm well aware there are experts across the world, and passive houses, for example, are being built right, left and centre. So we need to catch up with more of those people, find out about those who are striving right around the globe to build energy efficient homes or using environmental design. This is actually what we're going to be looking at today, because I suppose we have focused a lot on low energy design, but not as much on understanding environmental design. So that's what we want to get stuck into today. And we're going to chat to architectural designer Wilf Meynell. He's my guest. First up, I asked him how he'd come to work in this area.
I studied architecture at Brighton University and went and did a diploma at University of East London, where I was tutored by Sophie Pelsmakers, who I have to credit a lot for where I've moved to. And I think my main interest in environmental design was I was brought up in the countryside and always had a connection myself with the environment and my surroundings. You know, when I was young, I could feel the hot sun coming through a south-facing window, or I could open a door and feel a draft come through. That connection with the environment has pushed me to try and get that into architecture of the future.
And do you feel that the way things are going, they are moving more towards low energy design? Is that the point of this?
I think so. I think, as technology improves, we're finding that buildings can monitor themselves better. They can, ensure that we don't overheat or we don't get too cold. And I think, I guess we're starting to lose the connection between opening a window or putting a log on a fire, where it's very clear that we are trying to control our environment ourselves.
Is this an idealistic thing really to be focusing on the environment when, in fact, we could be walking out of the door whenever we fancy. The point is that we want the low energy design. We have to get to this point.
In some ways, I guess it is a bit idealistic, but I think that because we're so focused on low energy design, which I think is great in a way, we're starting to lose focus on some very, very simple basics of environmental design in terms of the right specification of the right local source materials, looking at the sun and where we can get as much energy from the sun, obviously prevailing winds and natural ventilation. I think we're starting to lose that a bit as we focus so much on trying to get the percentage of energy demand down by 80%, 85%, 90%. And I think it would be good if we could start to try and combine the idea of low energy design and proper environmental design.
Maybe we could take this to an extreme. So if we neglected this, how do you think it would manifest itself?
What might happen is that we end up having buildings which really do control themselves, in the sense that no one even has a control panel anymore, and buildings monitor themselves constantly and change the temperatures and all sorts. And I think although that might be a good thing, on a human scale, we'll start to really lose that connection with our environment. We'll start to lose the connection with what our sun's doing, how it moves, where it is, things like that. And I think the more you lose connection with the environment, the more that can have a knock-on effect to things like recycling and landfill, where you just our environment is a body in which to store things we don't want. I think that could be a danger of the way that low energy design is pushing us.
Maybe we could look at an example then of how you have implemented this into Springfield House, which is a project that's hopefully underway in the coming months.
Yeah, Springfield House was interesting because we didn't have a site initially, which was, I guess, quite good from an environmental design point of view, because it meant that we could spend some time choosing the site to have as much from nature as possible. And the site we chose is on a slight bank. It's south-facing. There's a woodland around it, which is well managed, so there's plenty of timber, both for construction and also for fuel. So I guess the starting point at Springfield House was, let's try and get as much from the sun. We know where the prevailing winds are. Let's try and get as much from natural ventilation. Let's look at the materials of the building straight away to see what we can use for cladding, what we can use as a fuel source. Those key environmental concepts really help push Springfield House towards Code for Sustainable Homes Level 6 before really considering all the so-called green technologies.
Talk me through natural ventilation, because a lot of the podcasts that we've done have been on passive house, and of course in that case you're really controlling the ventilation. So natural ventilation, it's a nice idea. You're obviously going to be very in touch with the environment around you, but it's this control thing again. Control can be good sometimes. No, you're wanting it natural.
Absolutely. Natural ventilation can be quite complex when you've got obviously very high insulation values and very high air tightness. One of the most important considerations is the depth of plan. So obviously if you've got a very deep plan of building, you've got a lot of air to move from one side of the building to the other. So Springfield House is a U-shaped effectively, so the plan never reaches a depth of more than about 4 metres. Also high ceilings stop obviously your heat building up at the top of the ceiling space, and also things like having a high facade can start to pull a lot of air and wind around a certain area, so you can start to use that to try and bring that into the building. One of the other things you should always look at with natural ventilation is a kind of stack effect. So if you can get a high level opening window, so Springfield House has one single Velux over the stair, which is in the core of the building, that really helps to bring all the air from a kind of low point in the extremities of the building up through the core and out through that openable window.
I'm sure I'm asking a silly question here, but what happens when the wind changes direction?
It's not all based on the prevailing wind. Springfield House is angled towards the prevailing wind to get maximum use of natural ventilation. But because you've got a high-level roof light, which is giving you the stack effect, whichever direction it's going in, it's still going to pull air out of the building and wick it out the building. Obviously, you're not going to always need to be ventilating your building constantly through the winter, as it won't be so hot, but you'll want to occasionally purge the air. So you'll want to quickly open that window for 10 seconds, wash all the smelly air out, and bring all the fresh air in, and then close it, and you've lost very little heat.
Do you notice that a lot in terms of how you feel the air? Is it almost like having a breeze coming through?
I guess that depends slightly on the wind speed and the wind direction. it'll very much depend on which low-level windows you've got open. That's very important. Springfield House's core separates the two living spaces. So if you want to, you can close off the living spaces and just flush out the core, or you can open them up and flush out the whole building. So obviously you could have the danger of becoming drafty, but if you're controlling it carefully by opening it for 15 seconds, then it's just an immediate draft, an immediate kind of wicking through of the air.
As someone who puts my top priority building a house as energy efficiency, I know that this will concern me. So how does this affect the energy efficiency? Clearly, it can't be an airtight structure, or can it be if we've got the natural ventilation coming through?
It can be quite an airtight structure. In fact, there's no reason why it couldn't be getting close to kind of Enefit passive house. But one of the dangers of that is that, firstly, you can have a problem with the quality of the air in smaller rooms that are on the extremities of the building. And one of the other things is that Springfield House is looking to use timber to heat some of the spaces. There's one small stove going to be in the main living space. And obviously, when you're very, very kind of hermetically sealed, you have to bring in intake externally from the building, which adds cost and complication. And obviously, more gubbins means more embodied energy. So try to avoid that as much as possible.
Where is this balance then between the low energy design that Passive House clearly offers and getting it right with the environmental design? How do I know that this is a good route to take? You mentioned about the embodied energy, fair point, but how do I balance all that up?
Part of the problem is, in the conceptual phase of a design, often the environment isn't considered enough. So we don't think about exactly which direction we're facing, and we don't think about our prevailing winds. We don't think about designing with a certain plan depth. We don't think about using trees for solar shading, and we don't think about solar shading that much in general. It's one of those things that often gets plugged on. So I think if we were to start with the environmental concepts of very basic environmental design and then start to push it towards passive house, I think then you'd get a halfway house between the two, which I think at the current moment in this country would be better maybe in 10 years' time, when we have the supply chains and the manufacturing of high-end passive house standard materials in this country. I think it would be fantastic if we can really push towards passive house. But at the moment, so much stuff is coming from Central and Western Europe, and the embodied energy created in all that shipping and all that production is huge.
What about if you're in a town or a city, which I imagine a lot of us will be? Does all this then go out the window?
The same concepts can always apply because they're very basic. But obviously, if you're talking about a retrofit and you've already got a site, then you have to be a bit cleverer because you might not be facing south. So you might need to think about having less windows, less glazing, trying to keep any glazing on the north and the west and to some extent the east, keep those apertures very small, and try and find ways to bring the sun in, maybe looking more at thermal mass. So when you do get the sun in, you really get it in the building and you store it there. Then you can start looking at the use of green technologies to help improve the environmental performance. But I think that's always got to be the second stage.
I know that you use the strapline, low tech, low cost, high performance, clearly the way we'd want it all to go. But what do you mean specifically in terms of low technology when we look at Springfield House?
I think it goes back to, again, the kind of very basic environmental principles that are used. I touched briefly upon, for example, solar shading. Springfield House has two periscopic entities that look out over the site. And not only is that a part of the design that you can focus on these nice bits of the landscape, it's also about exactly what angle is the sun going to come in at in the summer. So you want to kind of stop as much of that as possible. So the overhang is about 1200 mil, which is perfect for stopping all the sun coming in the summer. And then as soon as the winter comes and the angle drops to about 16 degrees, most of the sun can then pierce through the building, heating it up. So that's a very low technology that's been in existence for hundreds of years. And then using trees is a nice way to kind of improve the efficiency of the building. Obviously, in the summer, when the trees are in bloom, you're stopping too much sun getting in. And then as soon as they drop the leaves in the autumn, you then get a lot more sun coming into the building to heat it up. And if you can then combine that with thermal mass, so you have a heavy, big, dense structure behind some glazing, especially for the winter, obviously you can then start to store some of that heat inside the building so that at night when it cools, your heat comes off and then you've got a more stable environment.
Is this instinctive to use as the person, as the occupant of the house, or I'm wondering whether people might just be very lazy and tend to want this control that more low energy design gives you.
I think definitely in a lot of cases that is correct. But for Springfield House, my client came to me wanting something that was very much hands-on approach to environmental design, where she could really monitor the building very carefully, but not in a sense where you're trusting a control panel to do that. It's more a case of she's been around enough to know that if you open a window, you will get some draft come through. And if you close the curtains on a hot summer's day, you will stop too much sun coming into the building. But I definitely agree that there's a danger that, let's say she moves out of the house in 10 years' time and someone else comes in, they don't quite know how it works as a system. But I think there's a very similar danger with something like Passive House, where people will be opening windows a lot in the summer and in the winter especially, and that tends to throw off a lot of your building dynamics to some extent.
Isn't that the point, though, that you have that freedom to open a window? There's nothing to say that you can't, other than what you want as the user. And I know that you've been in a Passive House office before, and I wonder whether that might be why you've come to this conclusion, because there will always be an argument in an office as to whether you have the window open or closed.
I think there's a very big difference between mechanically ventilated, very, very fresh, healthy air and air that you get directly from the outside. And there's something about it. I don't know if it's the same for everybody, but I actually really like the experience of feeling some actual fresh air coming directly from a window onto my face, if you see what I mean. And although, in theory, some of these pool systems, for example, are incredibly efficient and also provide incredibly healthy air, again, you start to lose touch with your environment. You don't smell the smells that are outside the building. You don't experience, what's going on outside the building. And I think that's something that it would be sad if we lost that completely.
Just moving to low cost, because cost is a massive issue. Even if you're wealthy and perhaps you're wanting a bigger house, no doubt costs will creep up on you again. So how is this low cost? Is it because it's locally sourced?
A lot of that. So there's been a lot of work gone in at the front end to try and find sources for materials that are local and also hoping to keep the cost down. So, for example, Springfield House is going to the local woodland, which is about 300 to 400 metres away from the building. And we've already gone around the woods and we've earmarked 3 western red cedar trees, which we are going to use to clad the building. And they're not going to be taken away to a sawmill. Instead, we're going to bring a mobile sawmill onto site. So there's very, very little mileage indeed for all that cladding material to move. So that's kind of one very small element at Springfield House that keeps it low cost. The other thing is it's built into a bank. All the spoil that's going to be excavated will be used to re-landscape on the site. So there'll be no spoil going off to landfill. That obviously reduces a bit of cost. By digging into the bank, not only are we improving the kind of acoustics coming from what is a very loud main road behind it, but we're also starting to get a bit of extra buffer temperature from the soil at the back of the building. Then also, by trying to rely mainly on the sun as your heat source and by having plenty of thermal mass, you have to put less into your heating system. So in Springfield House, we've just got a log boiler and a solar thermal panel, which is basically giving you both winter and summer heating, or winter and summer hot water, without having a mechanical ventilation system, which is expensive, but also has a maintenance cycle, whereas the sun doesn't.
Aren't there issues with using a log burner that you'd want to move away from that if at all possible? Or are you including that just because it gives you this palpable sense of heat in the house?
The log boiler is now recognised by the Renewable Heat Incentive. So its efficiency is incredible. I mean, you're getting efficiencies of between 90 and 95% now with some of the log boilers. In the days of old, when you've got an old stove burning away, you're getting a hell of a lot of smoke coming out the chimney at the top, so it's not burning very efficiently. So you're getting a lot of off-gassing as well. Whereas these new log boilers are incredibly efficient, and they buffer big thermal stores, which then can keep the heat in them for up to 48 hours sometimes. So looking at some of the stats you get from these systems, actually, my belief is that these are much more efficient than using gas, using oil, or to some extent trying to rely on too much solar thermal.
You mentioned thermal mass there, and I was wondering what that is in this scenario. If you're using your locally sourced timber, what is providing the mass?
I guess, well, concrete has a very bad rep, and rightly so, in environmental design. We haven't got any concrete in this building until we get to an in situ stair, which is it's an in situ concrete stair. It's right in the centre of the core of the building, and although it's not an environmental material, we'll try and get a specification which is as good as possible. But what that'll do for us, it'll take in a huge amount of the sun's heat, and actually the stair is oversized, and it has a large concrete wall as well, which pierces through both floors. So it'll take in a lot of the sun's heat during the day, especially in the winter, and it'll just give back gently to the building. And also in the summer, it can provide cooling, because rather than that heat being in the air, it's in the concrete. And because it's in a core, that core can be shut off from the main living spaces. So it can be quite a good way of providing a very natural control system for the heating.
Are there any other aspects of the environmental design that we haven't touched on?
I'm sure this has been touched on a lot in your previous podcast, but fabric first is really important. Really got to consider not only let's try and cram as much insulation in a wall as possible, but also the kind of building dynamics of that. What materials you use, how much it can breathe. Are you going to get moisture because you put the insulation too much internally and not externally? So with Springfield House, we're looking to build the whole thing out of timber frame. And also we're looking to build it out as a stick build, which basically means we're going to build on site using timber rather than bringing in a prefab frame from Ireland or wherever it might be. And by using a timber frame, obviously what we're trying to do there is sequester carbon inside the timber. You know, if this building lasts for 200 years, you could argue that then that timber isn't rotting for 200 years, which is slowly starting to bring the balance of carbon in the atmosphere back down again, which is one of the problems we've got with global warming. So timber frame in the construction industry is, I think, fantastic. I think if you can, you should. And then insulation-wise, we're looking to use natural insulation materials on the inside of the building so that the air quality is very healthy internally. Obviously, we're looking to do a low-cost design. We're going to have to look at using things like mineral wool internally. But I think a lot of buildings, from my experience, when they get value engineered, the mineral wool goes back in. And I think there's no point in trying to pretend that we can afford that with this particular scheme.
So what does that mean for Springfield House, the air tightness that you will hope for?
We're looking to get an air tightness of around 3, which is about 3 times better than building regs and about 3 times worse than NFIT. We're not looking to get too airtight, as we've got obviously a stove working, and we want to ensure that we're not going to get issues with moisture based on it being just too hermetically sealed effectively.
Okay, I probably should have brought that in earlier, but it just suddenly popped into my head. Yeah, brilliant. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground today. So, Wilf, is there a final thought that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I think in some ways what I'd like to say is that it's amazing that we're moving towards passive house, and there's so much momentum behind it, because it's obviously a real exemplar of low energy design. But what I'd like to say is that can everyone who's designing them and people who are specifying, can they try and find local source materials as much as possible, and not just rely on certified materials that come from Austria and Switzerland, because I think it really needs to be considered the embodied energy that goes into those materials in their transport and their production.
Wilf, thank you very much.
Thank you.
With each episode, we like to provide the key learnings on our website and try to tie that in with the more visual elements. So for this session, it's houseplanninghelp.com/34 to get through to the show notes. I've also got a question for you. Is your build guided more by low energy design or environmental design? Maybe you can tell me your story, or perhaps you think you've got the best of both worlds. So put your comments at the bottom of the show notes there. Actually, I do like it when coincidences happen, and this was the case. I was writing a blog post on an autonomous house. This is owned by Lizzie Stoodley and Mike Coe. But it was fascinating to learn about it, because if you don't know much about what an autonomous house is, in many respects they're self-sufficient. So this house, for example, had no gas connection, there's no water mains connection, they deal with their own waste. They are connected to the grid, but I think the main reason for that is to export support energy and almost use them a bit like a battery. But what was fascinating was to find out that the side effect of living this way is just having much more of a connection to the environment and having to pay attention to what the weather was doing and whether it was likely to rain. So I definitely recommend that you go and check out that article and see how it brings the responsibility for resources back to you. So I'll link that in with the show notes. Just a couple more things. Firstly, my ebook. I had hoped to have released it by now, but this is the first time I've written an ebook, really. So I'm learning along the way, and I'm learning that it's actually quite a lot of work, even though I want it to be short and I'm going to try and condense it down. But the fact that I've tried to complicate it by putting in video and audio bits and pieces, of course, it is taking longer, but I will get there eventually, and I hope that you'll be up for reading this. And let's just finish up on a call to action. I'd love it if you sign up to our email newsletter. What we've got on there is exclusive content that we reserve for our email list, and hopefully it will inform and inspire you on your journey as you go to create a low energy house. It's also interactive too, and I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who has contributed, quite often with ideas that then get turned into podcast episodes. And if I haven't responded to something that you've sent me, you never know, it could be in the pipeline. I have my long list of things that I want to get to eventually, so we're never going to run out of content. There's plenty more mileage where this is concerned. So if you want to join the email newsletter, go to houseplanninghelp.com/subscribe. Next time, my guest is Lloyd Alter from treehugger.com, and this is going to be an overview, really. We're looking at some of the worldwide trends in green architecture. That's next time. Until then, take care.